Not of empowering learning. We've been working with children and adults for 20 years, helping them improve literacy, numeracy, concentration, sensory overload, anxiety, and lots of the diagnoses they've been given. This is some work we've done with what I call the Tinies, the under 7 group in nursery and reception years in the UK. And the title is, I Wish I'd Known This When My Kids Were Younger, because parents so often say that to me when they've found out some of the information in this video. This is an image that I found on the internet and sums up why working with the Tinies is a passion of mine, because it is much easier to build strong children than to repair broken adults. What we're doing here is to enable the Tinies to use some of the skills we have learnt from older children to hopefully stop them getting so confused. As I say, it's always been a passion of mine to work with the under 7s, understanding their experience and giving them useful skills. Some things have really confused me over the years. For example, autistic children could make great progress and then disappear into themselves around the age of 2. This seemed really weird. And dyslexics can be struggling with literacy but don't get diagnosed until the age of 7. And all these years in between of useful education have just gone missing with more stress. So my question was, what's happening in the young ones? There's a few parallel streams about creativity that I've put together. One is visual strengths. Empowering learning is known for identifying people's visual strengths and using those strengths for other stuff too. Standardization in teaching. The late Ken Robinson has been saying that children lose creativity for years, and specifically in his book called Creative Schools, trying to teach everyone in the same way doesn't work for everybody. And then there is people that lose creativity as they get older. It just gets lost. And NASA did some work on identifying creative geniuses that I'll share with you. Then there is the difference between diagnosis and assessment, which will enable children to get allowances for learning differences. That ignores the work we do with parental education, with parents and teachers. One of my big questions is what goes on behind the behaviours. The why are people doing what they're doing? Because there is always a positive intention for anybody to be exhibiting some behaviours. So I start off with strengths, and that might seem odd, but look behind the strengths. Look at how they are doing what they're doing. Mental imagery is the root of many of these skills. How to stop them moving is another question. Grounding stabilizes mental imagery. And why do some people find it so difficult? Because some people are so stressed they're permanently in their sympathetic and they can't keep mental imagery still. Then what goes on behind that? So if you breathe well, that'll reduce your hyperactivity. And then there is sleep, which makes everything better. So this is a very holistic approach, and you may want to add a few more details in as well. It is not obvious to most people that behind learning difficulties there is often unrecognized mental imagery symptoms. So I'm going to give you a little overview here. Let's take poor literacy, dyslexia and dysgraphia first of all. 100% of dyslexics are not visualizing words. They're not picturing still letters and still words. So they've got nothing to copy down onto a piece of paper. There is nothing in an educational psychologist report that reports on this interesting fact. Poor numeracy and dyscalculia. These people are not visualizing numbers. I have a maths degree. I was always visualizing numbers, and I couldn't understand why people found it so difficult. Then there's ADHD. They have too many screens, and their middle name tends to be distracted. Sometimes the screens are too near to them, which can be frightening. Sometimes they are so far away they can't see them. They can't concentrate on one thing at a time and may be easily bored and disruptive. Dyspraxia and DCD, they can't control their mental images. And when it comes to Asperger's, sensory overload, 48XXYY and autism, and even intense imagery movement, they have cascades of uncontrollable mental images with no structure, increasing anxiety. In overwhelm, you can't concentrate on anything, creating boredom and disruptive behaviour. Visual recall can be excellent, whilst visual construct can be frightening. This is why when you take a child to a new shoe shop, for example, they can find it deeply worrying because their excellent mental imagery can recall what the shoe shop looks like, but they don't like the idea of a new one at all. IIM describes fanciful imagery that stimming enhances even more and can be better than reality. Hyperlexia is an obsession with the way words sound and no understanding of the meaning. OCD traits, the repeated action that have not been captured visually. For example, if you keep a mental image of locking the front door, then you'll be able to recall that and not have to do it again. Some OCD traits can be dramatically improved by getting mental imagery under control. And finally, there's PTSD, terrifying mental images and videos without a safe ending. If you can give them a safe ending or change their videos or help them improve them, then some of the PTSD symptoms will move. I just want to say something about sensory overload. Sensory overload is complete confusion inside your head. Most people think it's caused by the outside world. I thought that, for example, when you take a child to a shopping precinct, there is all too much going on and they can't concentrate. But actually, it also can be generated by their inside world. In the middle of the night, they can wake up, for example, and they've got dreams, mental images going on in their heads, and again, that can put them into sensory overload. If they're very ungrounded, and many of these children are, they're out of their body, they're not fully grounded in their body, and they can pick up other people's energy. So then not only do they have to deal with their own energy, but they're having to deal with somebody else's as well. Stimming and zoning out enables them to feel more comfortable in themselves by a repetitive action that they know exactly what's going to happen. So there's no fear of the unknown. Stress, rage and meltdowns and violence, anybody can do this when things get too much. I recall the other day I was trying to do 10 things at once and somebody came in and asked me another question and it was last like, please just wait until I finish some of these. Let me get some of the 10 finished before you ask me that. But kids haven't learnt that language. And going autistic, this is an extraordinary experience. I had a client in America whose son went autistic. He went autistic when he was about 2 years old in the usual way. Dad was trying to help him. I talked to him about mental imagery for literacy and numeracy and grounding. He did a lot of work with his lad with neuro-linguistic programming, etc. Years later, I spoke to him and I said, how's your lad? And he said, I don't think he's autistic anymore. And I said immediately, well, what did you do? And he said, everything was about making him feel safe. I made him feel safe in everything he was doing, whether it was eating, schoolwork, riding his bike, whatever. It's all about him feeling safe. Another 2 years further on, and he was about 8, doing really well. He said to his dad one day, I used to go autistic when I couldn't cope with what was going on internally or externally. This was his stim, to go autistic and block out the rest of the world. What an amazing insight for an 8-year-old to know that's what was happening, and for his dad to know what was happening. So now we're going to look at some of these causes, some of these things behind the behaviours. So let's look at the strengths. Firstly, we always identify strengths in our students and their metacognition, in other words, how they're doing what they're doing to facilitate their learning. And we teach all the students how to use mental images for pictures, for stories, and for memory. So we're getting them to make friends with their mental imagery. We make this inclusive of everyone in a class, including all those with any SPLD and hearing impairments. And this is one of the things we've identified for older students, and we come back to use with tinies time and time again. And it might seem odd to start with strengths, but actually these strengths can get you really confused. So let's look at the mental imagery behind these. So the first cause to address is their mental imagery and to make sure that it's under control. Firstly, teach everybody to make friends with their mental imagery, as I've mentioned. Then watch their eyes. When their eyes look up, they'll be looking at their mental imagery. When their eyes look down, they'll be in their emotions. So when you're working with mental imagery, you always want students to be looking up. Teach everyone to be playful with their images. Teach them how to change them from the past, the present, and the future. So if they've got an image they don't like, teach them what they can do with it. They can change it, or they can throw it in the bin, or they can throw it over the hill, or they can throw it out into the garden. If it's in the present, then they can control their mental images in the present. They can actually get them to stop. And if it's in the future, which is where a lot of people do anxiety, then you can get them to change their mental imagery. I remember a little girl who was frightened of going to secondary school after she'd fainted in primary school. And I said to her, "What are you frightened of?" And she said, "People will walk on me." And I went, No, you don't realise. In secondary school, there is a medical room where a very nice lady is, and she will, if you are ill, she will take you into the medical room and look after you. Nobody will walk over you, I promise. And her face lit up and went, "Oh, into problem," and dramatically reduced her anxiety. The next one is increasing confidence. This was a complete surprise to me, and there's not much that surprises me these days. But talking to children about their mental images gives them confidence and can get them to come out of their shells in class. Everyone has mental images, and if you don't use them, you may tend to lose them over time. We can all recognise our parents, our kids, etc. So we've all got mental images, we might not use them very often. We can teach all these children how to picture words for spelling and reading, in parallel with phonics for new words, and numbers for numeracy. We can focus teaching nouns first associated with pictures, leaving high-frequency words until later. That's the way we teach students how to start using their word form area in their brain. Only progress to non-nouns on a whiteboard once nouns are secure. There are several detailed visual tips, including propping a book up for improved reading when grounded, visualizing number triangles for times tables, creating pictures of what you've just read for comprehension, etc. The list goes on and on. So behind mental images, let's have a little look at what might be some of the challenges. If you're not grounded, you may not be able to stabilize the images, and they may run around and confuse you. So you need to get them under control. Grounding is the way we get them under control. There is nothing weird about grounding. It's used by elite sports for decades, and it's never got into education. Although grounding is like a really super fast subset of mindfulness, which has got into education now. One grounding exercise might be put your hand on your belly, take your shoes off, walk in nature, and just feel yourself fully in your body. One of the things we do is to encourage people to imagine a tree and that they've got roots coming out of their feet right down to the centre of the earth and then spreading right out so that they're really firmly connected to the ground. And most times you can actually see people's shoulders drop. You might, for example, notice what they're eating. If they're eating grounded foods, which means foods that are grown in the ground, like potatoes and carrots and parsnips, then they are likely to be more grounded. Junk food will make them ungrounded. Then there is sand timers. I really like sand timers. We use these a lot with kids. So if you take a sand timer and just turn it over and say to the child, just watch the sand coming down for a minute or so, and as the sand goes into the bottom of the sand timer, you just feel yourself more and more grounded. And quite often, if a child is in the habit of getting ungrounded, I will offer them a sand timer and say, when you turn your sand timer over, we won't talk to you anymore because you're probably a little bit confused. There is also bubbles, those little tubes of bubbles you can get to blow for little children. They're really good for getting people to just concentrate. There is things like timeouts, but I really don't like timeouts, whether they're at home or whether they're at school. When a child's in a timeout, they miss a lot of the school day or the home day. There is fish oils that's got a good effect on being grounded. And of course, there's loads of research on weighted blankets. And you really don't need to buy a weighted blanket. You can just use a lot of heavy blankets that you might have around the house. Then there is energetic clearing and releasing blocks. If a child has had a trauma, then this would be a really good technique. And on my YouTube channel, you'll find mini videos for this. For sensitive children, they may be picking up other people's stuff, and that will be increasing their sensory overload. So grounding will enable them to let go of it into the ground. Also encourage children to work out their own answers, not guess what's in the teacher's head, because that's going to get them into their energy system. The next cause can be lack of safety. Firstly, can you reduce the student's stress and reinforce their feelings of safety in every aspect of learning? This is really important. Teach everyone how to change or get rid of negative emotions. When a child doesn't speak, act as if you understand, especially when they start to speak. It's really important to let them feel they're being understood, even if you don't completely understand what they're saying. They won't have the language to correct you, and all you can do is do your best. But if you stop them and correct them, many children are likely to go into reverse and stop speaking. Give them small portions to eat, and preferably choice. Too much food can generate overwhelm. And havening, which is one of my favourite techniques. And it really is no more complicated than what you would do with a baby. Stroke their shoulders, stroke their back, help them to relax. And of course, you need to be relaxed in order to help them to be relaxed. Then there is another one behind safety. If they're not feeling safe, they're probably not breathing well. Mouth breathing feeds and creates anxiety. If you breathe out heavily, then you will reduce oxygenation in every cell of your body, which feeds clumsiness and hyperactivity in your brain. So keep your mouth shut unless you're eating or speaking. We do have another video on this to help you. Behind breathing is the fundamental topic of sleep. It's really important to understand sleep deprivation and what it does to the human body. To know whether you're deprived of sleep, the question is, how do you feel in the morning? Do you need to be woken up by an alarm clock, or do you wake up naturally feeling bright-eyed and bushy-tailed? What are some of the things that are important for good sleep? A good bedtime routine. So it's really important to keep consistency in your environment and to learn as young as possible how to put yourself to sleep. And of course, there's obvious things like avoiding screens and computers and all that sort of stuff that you probably know about. And the question I always have is, do you need an alarm clock to wake you up? Just to give you a few bits of research that relate to this, NASA started a project some years ago to look for creative geniuses, and they were surprised at what they found out. But firstly, they recruited creative geniuses because, as you can imagine, at NASA, They need a lot of very clever people. They then went on to check how the same process worked for identifying creative geniuses in children. So the 4 to 5-year-olds were 98% of them were creative geniuses. And from my experience of working with kids, I totally agree with this. They are far more creative than I am. At the age of 10, they've dropped to about 30%. At the age of 15, it's gone down to 12%. And as adults, we're only 2% creative geniuses. Then another piece of research we found was that 75% of ADHDers in the USA are mouth breathers. Mouth breathing stops you retaining enough carbon dioxide to oxygenate every cell in your body, and if you don't oxygenate enough cells in your brain, you will be hyperactive. We have got other YouTube videos specifically on nose and mouth breathing. This is some information from a group of reception year children who were 4 and 5-year-olds in a class of 24 of them. And what we wanted to know was what their mental imagery was like. So we took them aside one at a time for just 5 minutes each to check out what they were doing with mental imagery. And this was the result. 19 of them were totally fine with their mental images. Most were really creative. And for example, when we asked them to think of an elephant, we would get rainbow-coloured elephants doing ninja dancing. So they were the creative crew. Some were thinking about standard elephants, just big grey elephants. One had no mental images, and we believe that he's had some trauma early in his life, and he'd managed to delete his mental images because they were too scary, but we could help him deal with that. So he could be selective about what mental images he wants. 2 or 3 of them had unstable mental images and were not good at spelling and reading, which is completely logical because if words are jumping around, then they won't be able to concentrate and they won't be able to spell and read well. And then we have one child who was overwhelmed, disruptive, angry and violent, and he was definitely showing signs of ADHD and autism. But we certainly helped him by finding this at the age of 4 or 5, and we could help him get control over these images that were frightening him. Then there was a class of year 7s that we investigated, and I wouldn't like to call this research. This basically was a self-assessment by all of the class of girls who were about how good their spelling was, their maths was, etc. And so this was 11-year-olds that were just going into secondary school, and they'd come from a lot of different schools in their primary schools. So 28% of them were poor at spelling. So this is what they assessed. They've just gone into year 7 at 11, and they are saying they're really poor at spelling. 12% were saying they're really poor at reading. 28% were not visualizing words. And if they're not visualizing words, it stands to reason they're going to be poor at spelling. And 31% were poor at numeracy and 38% were not visualizing numbers. And so the obvious thing strikes me from some of this stuff is that if they are not visualizing words and they reckon they're poor at spelling, why don't we just teach them? And if they're not visualizing numbers and they reckon they're poor at numeracy, why don't we just teach them? So it's all too obvious to me. And I'll just give you a bit more information here. Of those who were poor at reading, 31% didn't visualize words. 100% reckoned they were creative. So of the kids who were poor at reading, 100% of them reckoned they were creative, and 31% of them didn't visualize words. 46% didn't remember what they read, so they'd never learnt to create images of what they are reading, which is a really useful skill for comprehension. Of those who were poor at spelling, 48% had poor handwriting, 48% aren't visualizing words, and 24% can't keep words still. A simple skill, teach them grounding and they'll be able to get keep words still. Of the good spellers, 84% could see words. What a surprise. 13% weren't sure, and 3% were absolutely convinced they couldn't, which is probably the ones that were so good they wouldn't even notice they're visualizing words. Of those who are poor at numeracy, 61% aren't visualizing numbers. Of those who are good at numeracy, 71% are visualizing numbers. And again, there was a few that weren't sure and some that insisted they couldn't do it, but I think they didn't realise how good they were at it. People often say empowering learning makes so much perfect sense. This is the thing that people say to me time and time again. In my book, The Elephants in the Classroom, which I'm just going to make an apology for, if anybody's listening to this who is on the autistic spectrum, they will find The Elephants in the Classroom a deeply depressing title, because to them it means you've got children who are elephants running around the classroom causing chaos. It wasn't meant to be that at all, so I do apologise. It was meant to be the metaphor, which was the elephant in the room. So it's the things that people know about but don't actually take action upon. And I was looking through the list of 27 in the elephants in the classroom, and I believe that if we change these things that just don't make sense, we'd have a dramatic reduction in learning difficulties and an explosion of skills with exceptional learning differences, rather than people dropping into learning difficulties. We've seen older children, how they can change. These are presents for younger children. We can help them avoid getting into the challenges and diagnose conditions. So let's just walk you through the ones that I think, the 7 that I think are particularly important for younger ones. There is no training in good breathing, sleeping and grounding in school or before for parents. None of this is mentioned in reports. How are our parents expected to know this? Idioms, as I mentioned earlier about the elephants in the classroom, idioms can't be understood by highly visual children. Primary maths presupposes that children can visualize counters, dice, numbers, etc. Nobody says that. Nobody tells them how to do it. High frequency words have few nouns, which is the way to get the word form area working. The focus is always on behaviour, not what is going on behind the behaviours. It is accepted that visual word recognition is needed for fluent reading, but it is neither checked nor taught explicitly. Students who cannot concentrate in class can focus on a computer for hours, so it's all about what they're doing. Thank you for listening to this. I hope you've enjoyed it. My name is Olive Hickmott. I'm a learning coach, and that's my telephone number. You're welcome to contact me. There is a website at empoweringlearning.co.uk, and there is my blog at olivehickmott.co.uk. You're welcome to contact me there. There is also, I've got loads of free resources on my YouTube channel, which is Olive Hickmott, and also on Facebook. So I do hope you've enjoyed what you've heard and that it's given you some good ideas, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.